In the cold, final twilight of the Third Reich, as the eastern and western fronts inexorably collapsed inward toward the heart of Europe, the German leadership was consumed by a desperate, almost manic obsession, the creation of a Wunderwaffe, a miracle weapon. This wasn't merely wishful thinking, it was a furious, all-consuming rush to weaponize genius, to snatch technological superiority from the jaws of operational defeat. Germany's factories, even those shattered by relentless Allied bombing, strained to produce machines that could reverse a war that, by any rational calculation, was already lost. The world, even today, remembers the icons of this frantic effort. There was the menacing silhouette of the Messerschmitt Me 262 Schwal, the world's first operational jet fighter, a machine whose mere presence temporarily paralyzed Allied daylight bombing raids. There was the sleek, predatory Arado AR-234 Blitz jet bomber, capable of reconnaissance runs that outpaced any pursuing piston-engine fighter. For the enthusiasts of the truly esoteric, there were the rocket-powered interceptors, like the terrifyingly volatile Messerschmitt Me 163 Comet, a machine that killed nearly as many of its own pilots as it did Allied airmen, but which represented pure, unadulterated speed. But concealed behind the shadow of these famous, if doomed, projects was an initiative so radical, so dangerously experimental, that it remains almost entirely forgotten today. It was a project born in the deepest recesses of wartime improvisation, a jet aircraft that was the aviation equivalent of a ghost. It never received a proper, official designation. No. AR. Merely a cryptic internal Garrett number. It never reached the grim, necessary milestone of full production, and in the entire, chaotic history of its existence, this machine, built for speed, flew precisely once. This obscure, nameless aircraft promised an aerial velocity that transcended anything Germany had ever dared to conceive. The engineers, working in drafty, camouflaged workshops buried deep in the forests of central Germany, whispered of speeds that would make the Me 262 look sluggish, velocities that would render Allied interception tactics instantly obsolete. It was meant to be the ultimate, untouchable interceptor, the final ace up the sleeve of the Luftwaffe. It was meant to be the future. Instead, this ambitious, revolutionary design culminated in a tragedy of staggering brevity. Its operational life, from initial taxi tests to its ultimate, terrifying conclusion, spanned perhaps a few harrowing weeks. The experiment that promised to redefine aviation became, instead, one of the shortest, most costly, and most disastrous aviation experiments of the entire Second World War, a cautionary tale written in smoke and twisted metal, barely remembered, yet holding a chilling lesson about the desperate extremes of wartime innovation. The sheer terror of its sole journey was enough to guarantee that the project ended almost as soon as it began. The spark for this doomed project ignited in the smoke-filled, bunker-like offices of the Reichsluftfahrtministerium, RLM, the German Air Ministry, in the late summer of 1944. By this point, the calculus of the air war had shifted irrevocably against the Luftwaffe. The sky over the Reich was no longer contested. It was dominated by the relentless silver tide of Allied heavy bombers and the long-range fighter escorts, most notably the North American P-51 Mustang, that swarmed them. Every day brought a fresh wave of destruction, targeting fuel depots, ball-bearing factories, and aircraft assembly plants. The existing wonder weapons, the Me 262 and the AR-234, while brilliant, suffered from a critical, fatal flaw. They were complex, resource-intensive, and demanded high-quality, strategically vital materials like chromium, nickel, and aluminum, resources the Reich simply no longer possessed in the necessary quantities. Production lines were slow, and the few jets that did reach the squadrons were often grounded for lack of fuel or replacement parts. The desperate order that launched the unnamed jet was the epitome of late-war expediency, a demand that synthesized pure technological ambition with industrial poverty. A small, hand-picked team of aeronautical designers, men who had made their careers in the avant-garde fringes of flight research, was given a terrifyingly concise brief: create a jet interceptor, and do it now. The criteria were almost contradictory. Speed and climb. It had to possess a rate of climb and top speed that would guarantee a successful intercept of high-flying bombers before they dropped their payloads. This meant challenging the speed barrier itself. Simplicity of construction. It had to be so simple that it could be manufactured by semi-skilled labor in decentralized, hidden workshops, perhaps even utilizing slave labor, far from the bombing targets. Cheap materials. The design had to minimize, or eliminate entirely, the use of strategic alloys. Wood, steel piping, and low-grade sheet metal were to be the primary structural components. Short lifespan. Crucially, it was accepted that this aircraft was a disposable asset. It needed to fly fast enough, once or twice, to fire its rockets or cannons, and then land, or often, crash. Longevity was irrelevant. The lead designers, anonymous now to history, understood the brutal irony of the task. They were being asked to build the fastest aircraft in the world out of the lowest quality materials imaginable. The only variable they had left to manipulate was risk. To achieve the impossible performance metrics while adhering to the severe material constraints, they knew they would have to discard decades of established aeronautical wisdom. They had to take risks. Huge, fundamental, structural risks that bordered on engineering madness. The workshops became cauldrons of radical experimentation. Concepts that would have been dismissed out of hand in the golden age of 1930s aviation were now embraced as necessity. They began experimenting with radical shaping of the airframe, concepts like supercritical airfoils and highly swept surfaces that would only be fully understood decades later. They pushed the limits of weight distribution to achieve maximum thrust-to-weight ratio. They disregarded standard safety margins for structural integrity, opting instead for a minimal, gossamer light structure that could barely contain the forces they intended to unleash. On paper, meticulously drawn up on vellum salvaged from ruined drafting rooms, the machine looked undeniably groundbreaking. Its sketches showed a futuristic, almost predatory shape, a clean, almost wingless missile built around a powerful jet engine. Calculations showed it could theoretically achieve Mach numbers previously considered fantasy for propeller-less aircraft. It was the epitome of cutting-edge German theoretical design. But the designers, those who had to wrestle the theoretical into the tangible, knew the terrifying truth. Every revolutionary choice was a sacrifice of stability, a compromise of safety. It was not merely an experimental blueprint. In reality, it was a volatile recipe for catastrophic failure, a disaster waiting for a pilot to ignite it. The desperation of the Reich had forced them to draw up plans not just for a warplane, but for a deadly aerodynamic paradox. To understand the sheer, almost willful recklessness of this design, one must examine the specific, dangerous choices the engineers made in their quest for untouchable speed and devastating simplicity. The unnamed jet was not merely unorthodox, it was a brazen, near-suicidal combination of known aerodynamic hazards, all concentrated into a single, fragile airframe. The engineers effectively combined four distinct dangers into one unified weapon system, each component pushing the aircraft further away from safe flight parameters. The blade-like wing. To achieve the lowest possible drag, a critical factor for sustained, high-speed flight, the wingspan was brutally abbreviated. It was tiny, almost vestigial, giving the jet the appearance of a flying dart. This minimal span meant minimal frictional drag, promising spectacular top speeds. The deadly compromise. Wings generate lift. The smaller the wing, the greater the necessary speed to keep the aircraft airborne. At slow speeds such as during takeoff or landing, the wing was prone to tip stalling, a rapid, violent loss of lift at the wingtips that leads to an uncontrollable roll. Furthermore, the extreme wing loading meant the aircraft would be brutally stiff and unforgiving in turns, prone to entering high-speed compressibility stalls at altitude. It offered breathtaking velocity at the expense of maneuverability and low-speed control. 2. The hypersensitive tail. Tail surfaces. The vertical stabilizer, fin, and horizontal stabilizers, tail planes, were swept back at a dramatic angle. This feature was intended to maintain control authority even as the airflow over the wing neared the speed of sound, a phenomenon that caused standard tails to lose effectiveness. The deadly compromise. The design was hyper-optimized for high-speed stability, but that same radical sweep made the controls intensely sensitive at lower speeds. A pilot's minor input, a twitch of the control stick, could translate into an immediate, violent overreaction in pitch or yaw. It was like driving a racing car with the steering sensitivity cranked to the maximum. Responsive, yes, but lethally unpredictable. 3. The flailing fuselage. The desperate need to save weight and materials led to a fuselage built from the aeronautical equivalent of scrap. Thin-gauge steel, wooden ribs, and low-grade aluminum sheeting formed the airframe, barely adequate for the forces involved. The deadly compromise. This skeletal structure was forced to house the heart of the monster, the powerful, new-generation axial flow jet engine. These engines, particularly the prototypes of 1944, were notorious sources of powerful, low-frequency vibration. In a standard, robust airframe, these vibrations were dampened. In this lightweight, structurally compromised jet, the vibrations were amplified, threatening to literally shake the fragile wing attachments and tail assembly loose. The plane risked tearing itself apart, not from aerodynamic stress, but from its own internal power. IV. The ticking bomb. Center of gravity. But perhaps the most alarming design feature, the one that senior engineers pointed to with genuine dread, was the location of the center of gravity, CG. In any aircraft, the CG determines its stability. For conventional, safe aircraft, the CG is carefully positioned to provide a degree of inherent stability, meaning the nose tends to return naturally to a level attitude after a disturbance. In the nameless jet, to compensate for the massive weight of the jet engine crammed into the rear and the need for a short fuselage, the CG sat dangerously far forward, too close to the neutral point, the aerodynamic center of pressure. The deadly compromise. The plane was designed with near-zero static margin, meaning it possessed almost no inherent stability. If the nose dipped, the aerodynamic forces would not automatically correct it. Instead, the forces would encourage the nose to keep dropping, leading to a violent, irreversible pitch-down maneuver known as tuck-under. Even a small change in speed or engine thrust could shift the aerodynamic balance just enough to cause the nose to pitch violently and instantaneously toward the ground. The pilot was given no margin for error. Controlling the aircraft was a continuous, frantic, moment-to-moment battle against instability. It was, quite literally, a machine balanced precariously on a knife edge. The military hierarchy, blinded by the necessity of the Wunderwaffe and the relentless ticking clock of the war, saw only the theoretical speed. They demanded immediate results. The pressure from the RLM was overwhelming. They needed proof of concept, and they needed it yesterday. A test flight was ordered as soon as the prototype could be rolled out onto the airfield. Yet, the test flight order was met with silence and resistance from the flight crews. The senior pilots, the seasoned aces and respected test veterans of the Luftwaffe, men who had flown the Me-262 and wrestled the Me-163 Comet through its terrifying rocket burns, were shown the schematics. They saw the tiny wings, the fragile fuselage, and the deadly forward CG. These veterans, intimately familiar with the unforgiving physics of high-speed flight, understood instantly that this machine was less an aircraft and more a high-velocity coffin. None of the senior pilots wanted to touch it. They refused to stake their lives on a blueprint for disaster. The only way forward, given the desperation of the times, was to find a pilot expendable enough, or perhaps foolishly brave enough, to accept the assignment. The stage was set, the machine was fueled, and the terror was imminent. Bust in Silhouette Part 4, the pilot who said yes, the burden of obligation. The refusal of the senior pilots to engage with the nameless jet project created a profound crisis of confidence among the officers of the RLM Technical Office. The sight of battle-hardened veterans, men who had faced down formations of flying fortresses and survived the volatile chemistry of rocket planes, shaking their heads and walking away spoke volumes about the aircraft's inherent danger. They had deemed the prototype unairworthy, a technological dead end that offered only death. Yet, retreat was not an option. The war demanded sacrifice, and the bureaucratic machine of the Third Reich possessed a terrifying capability to find the necessary, however reluctant, individual to fulfill its mandates. The task of finding a pilot fell to the junior ranks, where ambition, inexperience, and the brutal pressure of wartime discipline combined to create fertile ground for compliance. Eventually, the pressure found its target in a young lieutenant, let us call him Klaus, though his identity, like so much of this project, is now obscured by the fog of history. Klaus was not an ace. He was a junior test pilot, fresh from training on advanced piston engine types, but lacking the deep, intuitive understanding of jet aerodynamics possessed by the veteran captains. He was idealistic, perhaps naive, and utterly steeped in the prevailing culture of loyalty and self-sacrifice. Klaus agreed to fly the jet. It was not a gesture of blind faith in the machine, nor was it a sign of exceptional courage, not yet, at least. It was the crushing weight of duty and the grim acknowledgement that someone had to. If the Wunderwaffe was to be realized, if the tide was to be turned, if Germany was to survive the crushing pressure from east and west, then the prototypes had to fly. His acceptance was less a boast of bravado and more a solemn, terrified surrender to his oath. The preparations for the flight were not conducted with the customary precision and care reserved for revolutionary aircraft. Instead, they were rushed, clumsy, and punctuated by a sense of impending doom that permeated the camouflaged hangar. Mechanics worked under floodlights, often shivering in the damp chill, desperately tightening bolts and splicing electrical wires. Before Klaus was even cleared to start the engine, he conducted a detailed pre-flight inspection, the walk-around, a ritual of professional integrity ingrained into every pilot. What he discovered was not merely unsettling, it was a catalogue of critical deficiencies that confirmed the darkest fears of the design team. His first concern centered on the flight control surfaces. The rudder, the vertical flap on the tail that controls the aircraft's yaw side-to-side motion, was visibly unstable. Even with the engine shut down, the control cables seemed slack, and when the surface was physically moved, it refused to center itself firmly. Instead, it wobbled slightly around the neutral position. It felt like a loose tooth in the jaw of the aircraft, Klaus later noted in a frantic, almost unreadable scribbled report. The tolerances were wide enough that I feared it would hunt, constantly moving, which, at the speeds projected, would induce uncontrolled oscillations, a deadly motion. In a conventionally stable aircraft, this might be a headache. In this radically unstable jet, a rudder that hunted could trigger a lethal high-speed yaw that the tiny wings could never recover from. Next, Klaus moved into the cramped, Spartan cockpit and tested the primary controls, the stick that controlled the aileron's roll and the elevator's pitch. The sensation was frighteningly inconsistent. When moved gently, the control stick felt excessively loose, sloppy, with far too much play before the control surfaces responded. This dead zone suggested poorly connected linkages or, worse, control flutter waiting to happen. Yet, when he attempted to apply full, smooth movement, the stick would suddenly become stiff, binding up, as if the control cables were fouling on internal structure or pulleys were jamming. A pilot relies on smooth, consistent feedback to make minute corrections. A control stick that was simultaneously loose and binding meant the pilot could not trust the machine to respond predictably. It introduced an element of random chance into every maneuver. Finally, during the initial engine run-up and low-speed taxi test across the improvised grass airfield, Klaus experienced the engine vibration problem firsthand. Even at speeds barely above a brisk walk, the entire airframe began to shudder and resonate. It was not the tight, predictable resonance of a well-balanced machine, it was a rattling, low-frequency tremor that made the instruments vibrate and blurred his vision. This was the promised power of the jet engine, coupled with the structural poverty of the fuselage, translating into an early warning: the machine could not contain its own power. The realization was visceral. The fragile structure was already being stressed to its limits, and the pilot hadn't even applied half thrust. The order to proceed. Klaus immediately shut down the engine and scrambled out of the cockpit. He sprinted across the muddy tarmac to the temporary field headquarters, a converted farm shed, where the RLM observer, a major of non-flying duties, and the lead engineer were waiting. Klaus delivered his grim assessment, laying out the critical flaws: the slack rudder, the binding controls, the severe vibration. He argued passionately, insisting that the aircraft required several days of painstaking adjustment, particularly to the control linkages and cable tension, before a first flight could be safely attempted. He asked for a delay. The lead engineer, a man gaunt from stress and lack of sleep, merely looked away, already knowing the answer. The major, however, was blunt and unforgiving. He represented the will of the Reich. "Lieutenant," the major's voice was clipped and final, "the schedules are set. The fuel expenditure has been authorized. The enemy is bombing Berlin while we discuss cable tension. These are prototypes. They are not required to be comfortable. They are required to fly and demonstrate the technology. You are clear to proceed with the full test profile." The urgency of the war, the fanaticism of the command structure, and the absolute need for a demonstration trumped every rule of engineering safety. The young pilot was given an order, backed by the full weight of military law, to fly a machine he knew was fundamentally broken. Klaus returned to the cockpit. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long, stark shadows across the makeshift runway. He strapped himself in, pulled the canopy shut, a thin sheet of plexiglass separating him from the violent forces of the atmosphere, and prepared to perform an act of duty that he suspected would be his last. He was about to introduce a blueprint for disaster to the real, unforgiving physics of the sky. The makeshift airfield was thick with the smell of high-octane kerosene, the fuel for the nameless jet's powerful engine, and the cold, damp earth of late-war Germany. On the ground, the small cohort of engineers and the RLM major watched in strained silence. The sound of the jet engine, a high-pitched, tearing shriek unlike the muffled roar of piston engines, cut through the tension. It was the sound of immense, unrestrained power being generated by a machine far too delicate to contain it. In the claustrophobic cockpit, Lieutenant Klaus slowly, deliberately advanced the throttle. He had already wrestled the shuttering controls into what he hoped was a reasonable takeoff setting. The acceleration was savage. The lightweight airframe, built for minimal drag and max velocity, surged forward with a shocking immediacy, leaving the ground crew momentarily stunned by its sheer, brutish speed. The ground roll was violently unstable. Even before the wheels left the turf, the flaws Klaus had pointed out during the taxi test became horrifyingly pronounced. The aircraft began yawing uncontrollably, a sudden, erratic wagging of the tail. This was the slack rudder, now catching the high-speed air and swinging freely, a pendulum of instability. The moment the main wheels lifted free, at a speed well below what the Mi-262 required for rotation, the problems escalated from severe to life-threatening. The aircraft, now free of the dampening friction of the ground, became a slave to its own lethal design flaws. The uncontrollable dance. Klaus immediately attempted to correct the yaw, applying gentle pressure to the rudder pedals. But the hypersensitive tail design worked against him. Instead of a smooth correction, the jet snapped into a sharp turn in the opposite direction. Every attempt to guide the aircraft onto a straight course sent it swinging violently back the other way, like a runaway sled on ice. The control inputs were not steering the plane, they were merely fueling its instability. The jet was fighting him, not responding to him. Simultaneously, the center of gravity issue began to manifest in terrifying pitch oscillations. The nose pitched up sharply, the consequence of the lift-off speed hitting the precarious aerodynamic center. The nose climbed steeply, threatening a low-speed stall, a certain death in a high-wing loaded aircraft like this. Klaus shoved the stick forward to correct the climb, but the forward-sitting CG, coupled with the binding controls, caused the opposite extreme. The nose dropped without warning, pointing the jet's sharp profile straight down toward the trees at the edge of the field. The spectators on the ground saw a plane that appeared to be flown by a drunken man or one caught in a violent crosswind, even though the air was calm. It was swinging left, then snapping right, its pitch gyrating wildly between climb and dive. The flight path was not a smooth ascent but a series of violent, oscillating maneuvers barely contained by the pilot's frantic, desperate efforts. The onset of flutter. Klaus managed to level the wings and gain a paltry 200 meters, approximately 650 feet, of altitude, fighting every centimeter of the ascent. It was at this moment, when the jet finally began to pick up the speed it was designed for, that the ultimate consequence of its lightweight construction and aerodynamic extremism struck. The entire aircraft began to shake with a speed and amplitude far beyond the low-frequency vibrations experienced on the ground. This was not engine vibration. This was a destructive oscillation known as aeroelastic flutter. Flutter occurs when the aerodynamic forces acting on a flight surface, like the wings or tail, become synchronized with the natural frequency of the structure itself. The forces feed the motion, causing the wing to flap and twist violently. The wings, built from thin metal and wood to conserve strategic resources, simply lacked the rigidity to dampen these forces. The movement was no longer just visible. It was palpable, an intense, blurring vibration that threatened to exceed the structural limits of the wing spars. In the deafening roar of the jet wash and the violent shaking of the cabin, the most chilling sound reached the pilot's ears, the sharp, unmistakable crack of the stressed aircraft skin. It was the sound of metal failing, of rivets shearing, of wood tearing away from the steel framework. The structural integrity was being compromised by the very speed it was designed to achieve. The oscillation, compounded by the airframe's fragility, was literally beginning to tear the plane apart in midair. Klaus's training, experience, and the instinct for self-preservation fused into a single, terrifying thought. He had only seconds before total structural failure, before the wing ripped off, before the tail assembly detached, sending the jet spinning into an inescapable terminal dive. The flight that was supposed to prove the jet's potential had, in less than 30 seconds, conclusively proved its utter, fatal instability. The test profile, which called for a sustained high-speed climb to altitude, was instantly and irrevocably aborted. The pilot was no longer performing a test. He was conducting an emergency landing while flying a machine that was actively disintegrating around him. His one and only mission was survival. With the terrifying realization that his jet was shedding its structural integrity at every increase in velocity, Lieutenant Klaus instinctively throttled back. The engine's deafening shriek dropped slightly in pitch, but the violent aeroelastic flutter, the blurring, destructive oscillation, did not immediately cease. The structural damage had already been done. Klaus knew the airframe's life expectancy was now measured in single-digit seconds. His only chance lay in getting the machine on the ground, now, before the wings snapped clean off. He wrestled the wildly oscillating nose down, trading the last of his scant altitude for speed, desperately seeking the crude strip of turf he had departed from moments earlier. The approach was less a controlled landing and more a controlled sacrifice of the machine. The jet's tiny, high-loaded wings required a blistering landing speed to maintain even marginal lift, and the binding, sloppy controls made precision impossible. Furthermore, with the rudder still uncontrollably hunting and the pitch demanding constant, exhausting correction, Klaus had no stability on the final approach. The ground rushed up fast. He flared the aircraft, attempting to pull the nose up slightly for a softer touch, but the landing gear, simplified for wartime production, lacked the sophisticated shock absorption of standard military aircraft. The jet hit the ground hard, its frail, lightweight structure unable to absorb the tremendous vertical force. The impact felt like a hammer blow through the seat and into the pilot's spine. The landing gear immediately buckled, shattering the thin wing spars and allowing the wing root to scrape along the dirt. The speed was too great for a mere skid. The crippled machine, still traveling at over 150 miles per hour, bounced violently back into the air, perhaps 20 feet above the runway, its movement completely dictated by physics, not the pilot's controls. When it came down again, the fuselage could take no more. It struck the ground at a severe angle, breaking apart just aft of the cockpit bulkhead, separating the pilot's protective cell from the massive, still-hot jet engine and tail section. In that catastrophic moment of structural collapse, fuel, highly volatile kerosene stored in simple bladder tanks, ruptured from the fractured lines. It sprayed across the white-hot metal of the jet engine exhaust nozzle and the friction-heated wreckage. With a sound like a great, hungry gulp, the remains of the fuselage instantly caught fire, sending a plume of thick, oily black smoke boiling into the pale evening sky. Klaus, trapped momentarily by the twisted wreckage and the crushing forces of the impact, was fighting for consciousness. The world was a spinning vortex of pain, heat, and the deafening crackle of burning jet fuel. The pilot's desperate training, the ingrained muscle memory of survival, kicked in. Ignoring the searing heat and the disorientation, he found the manual release for the canopy, the simplest escape route. He crawled out alive, miraculously pulling his battered body free from the flaming debris just as the fire began to consume the cockpit area. Shaken, his flight suit torn, his skin blistered by flash burns, but critically, conscious and breathing, he stumbled a few paces away before collapsing onto the grass, coughing against the smoke. Behind him, the aircraft was a total loss. The unnamed jet, designed to be the future of German air power, was now a funeral pyre, a pile of burning scrap metal and shattered carbonized wood, its disastrous 30-second flight conclusive proof of failure. The cancellation. The major and the engineers who witnessed the crash arrived moments later, not to cheer a successful test, but to view the smoking evidence of their flawed ambition. The sight was undeniable. The sheer violence of the structural collapse proved every fear the senior test pilots had voiced. The jet had failed not due to enemy action or pilot error, but simply because it was physically incapable of containing its own operating forces. The post-crash assessment was swift and brutally honest. The surviving airframe sections confirmed that the flutter and structural cracking had begun almost immediately upon reaching takeoff speed. The engineers, their faces etched with the grim reality of the war, quickly drafted a final report. They concluded that the design was fundamentally unsafe, possessing critical, inoperable instabilities caused by the extreme combination of low-grade materials and radical aerodynamics. More damningly, they noted that the required structural improvements, adding strength, rigidity, and stability, would demand vast amounts of strategic alloys and months of redesign. Within hours, the entire project was officially cancelled. The concept was shelved, the materials redirected to the Me-262 program, and the engineers ordered to move on to other, less ambitious projects. The shortest, most terrifying, and most conclusive flight in the Luftwaffe's history had delivered its verdict. The pursuit of the Wunderwaffe could not defeat the laws of physics. The cancellation of the project was merely the first step in its rapid disappearance from the historical record. The forces that created this nameless jet, desperation, secrecy, and chaos, were the same forces that ensured its total erasure. As the Allied armies continued their relentless advance from both the east and the west during the brutal winter of 1944–45, the German High Command issued standing orders for the systematic destruction of all sensitive military technology, particularly documents relating to advanced projects. This was known as the "scorched earth" policy, designed to prevent the enemy from gaining an immediate technological advantage upon capture. Consequently, most documents related to the aircraft were destroyed as German forces prepared to retreat from the airfield and the nearby research facilities. Laboratory notebooks were burned. Design blueprints were shredded or incinerated. Internal correspondence relating to the RLM order was pulped. The records that survived were often only tangential references, a budget line, a parts requisition form, offering frustratingly little context. Crucially, because the prototype never progressed beyond the pre-production phase and was destroyed on its first outing, the aircraft had never received a formal Luftwaffe designation. It remained only under its cryptic, internal development code, a Garrett number or similar works designation, which later disappeared entirely from the few surviving post-war records of German aviation research. When Allied technical intelligence teams, known as the T-Forces, swept through the ruined Reich, they found mountains of documentation, but this particular project left no clear, decipherable paper trail that tied the burned wreckage to a recognizable name. To the historians and post-war aviation experts reviewing the captured materials, the project became nothing more than a ghost, an ephemeral rumor. It was mentioned in a handful of fleeting reports recovered from the wreckage of a burned-out administrative center. It was half-remembered and obliquely referenced by a few captured engineers during exhaustive interrogations, but it was never definitively linked to a physical airframe or a concrete design philosophy. Its short life and violent demise ensured it was completely overshadowed by machines that actually made it into combat. The Me-262, the AR-234, and even the Me-163, all of which left behind substantial wreckage, surviving pilots, and dozens of supporting documents. The history books had no room for a jet that flew for less than a minute. Yet, its silence speaks volumes. The unnamed jet's only true legacy is the brutal, unspoken lesson it left behind for the handful of men who designed and witnessed its failure. It demonstrated that there is an absolute, unforgiving limit to the power of human desperation. It proved that innovation pushed too far, too fast, and supported by poor materials, can become a weapon against its own creators, a threat as immediate and deadly as any enemy the pilots faced in the sky. The history of aviation is often written by success. The tragic story of this forgotten jet is a crucial chapter written by failure, a permanent testament to the cost of attempting to defy the laws of physics under the tyranny of wartime necessity. It flew once, it proved everything, and then it vanished forever.